This presentation is about a paper I'm producing together with my supervisor Iko Mali and my co-supervisor Tom van Hout as part of my PhD research, which is funded by the Dutch Research Council. This paper is about ideological beliefs of big tech CEOs in relation to the organization of society. The event that gave rise to this research was a hearing about online platforms and market power that was organized by the American Antitrust Subcommittee as a component of a larger investigation into the adequacy of American antitrust regulations. During this hearing, the CEOs of Amazon, Google, Apple, and Facebook were invited to provide opening statements, which are the main data for this paper, and answer questions about antitrust and power online. What's important to understand is that the investigation of the subcommittee was supposed to demonstrate if and how American antitrust regulations should be changed in order to deal with major tech companies. Considering the fact that this hearing could have caused the subcommittee to propose changes to the antitrust regulations that could negatively impact major tech companies, it's reasonable to expect the four CEOs would want to produce effective discourse that deals with the antitrust concerns of the subcommittee. Discourse that might, therefore, be quite factual and maybe even juridical or economic. It might therefore come as a surprise that big parts of the CEO's opening statements didn't seem to focus on antitrust. In fact, the word antitrust was only mentioned once during the opening statements. To illustrate what type of things were said during these opening statements, I would like to show you the first 45 seconds of Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos' opening statement.
I was born into great wealth, not monetary wealth, but instead the wealth of a loving family, a family that fostered my curiosity and encouraged me to dream big. My mom, Jackie, had me when she was a 17-year-old high school student in Albuquerque. Being pregnant in high school was not popular. The school tried to kick her out, but she was allowed to finish after my grandfather negotiated terms with the principal. She couldn't have a locker, no extracurriculars, and couldn't walk across the stage to get her diploma. She graduated and was determined to continue her education, so she enrolled in night school, bringing me, her infant son, to class with her throughout.
Besides the fact that this narrative does not appear to focus on antitrust, it must also be noted that this was not the first time Bezos told this particular story about his mother.
My mom had me when she was 17 years old. She was a high school student in Albuquerque, New Mexico. You could ask her, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't cool in 1964 to be a pregnant mom in high school in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
What was interesting to see was that all four CEOs used their limited speaking time to tell stories they had told multiple times before. So I started from wondering why four CEOs of major tech companies would use the limited speaking time that was given to them in this particular context to talk about other things than antitrust. As an initial step, we must note that despite the fact that antitrust was not explicitly mentioned often in the opening statements, these opening statements were produced in response to looming antitrust regulations and public scrutiny, meaning that they must mean something in relation to antitrust and power. In this sense, the hearing and its opening statements can be considered critical discourse moments following the concept proposed by Chilton. Combined with the observation that a lot of things that were said during these opening statements were said before, I consider these opening statements entry points into a larger discourse concerning big tech's beliefs about the organization of society and their position within society. In addition to these points, it's also significant that the CEOs were given 5 minutes to perform their opening statements, and that these opening statements needed to be summaries of pre-written versions of the same opening statements. These pre-written versions were submitted to the committee before the hearing and published publicly on the committee's website. The existence of the public pre-written versions allowed for a comparison between the different statements, thereby showing what the CEOs deemed most important for this particular setting and audience. Thinking of the audience, it's important to note that the hearing was broadcasted live on television and YouTube and watched by millions of people. Considering that the CEOs must have been well aware of the reach of YouTube and other broadcasting platforms and the fact that this was not the first big tech hearing, they must have known that the subcommittee was not the only audience that would hear and see their opening statements. In this sense, hearings like these are becoming familiar stages that the CEOs can use to reach huge audiences. Considering the notion that this hearing is a public stage that can be utilized, I use pragmatics as a research perspective to shed light on this utilization. A critical approach towards discourse analysis was used to analyze big tech's ideological beliefs about the construction of society and the distribution and redistribution of power. And I also used a multimodal perspective to take into account the visual dimension of the hearing. I will briefly discuss this dimension at the end of my presentation. As I demonstrated earlier, the CEOs use personal narratives to communicate something in relation to antitrust, power, and the possible redistribution of power. I would like to show you another fragment of Basil's discourse in order to engage with the meaning of these personal narratives in relation to this particular context and the broader context of big tech's societal role.
My dad's name is Miguel. He adopted me when I was 4. He was 16 when he came to the US from Cuba by himself shortly after Castro took over. My dad didn't speak English and he did not have an easy path. What he did have was grit and determination. He received a scholarship to college in Albuquerque, which is where he met my mom.
In the opening statements, personal narratives are used to evoke the American bootstrapping myth and American dream. The CEOs display themselves as coming from a history of American strength and particular American values. In this specific fragment, the values of anti-communism and grit and determination. Despite the fact that not all the CEOs use the words grit and determination, the typical grit and determination attitude is present in all 4 opening statements. All 4 CEOs describe and point towards struggles and demonstrate how they managed to emerge victorious. What is striking is that the pre-written versions of the opening statements and other company texts appear to focus on a global perspective, whereas in these opening statements, the CEOs make explicit that their values and perspectives are uniquely American.
I've been Apple's CEO since 2011 and a proud employee of this uniquely American company since 1998.
In this sense, it is foregrounded that the CEOs see their values not as universal, but rather as typically American, and that they also want their audiences to accept these values as typically American, meaning that they are producing discourse to define and redefine which values the audience must see this way, a pattern that's also present in the following fragment from Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's opening statement.
The tech industry is an American success story. The products we build have changed the world and improved people's lives. Our industry is one of the ways that America shares its values with the world and one of our greatest economic and cultural exports.
And of course, the fragment also contains the much discussed notion that values can be produced and reproduced by and through technology. It becomes clear what the relationship between the global dimension and the nationalist dimension means. The CEOs and their companies embrace and utilize specific American values to explain their desired global dominance. In this sense, their focus is global, but from a specific techno-American perspective.
These are fundamental values for most of us, but not for everyone in the world. Not for every company we compete with or the countries they represent. And as global competition increases, there is no guarantee that our values will win out.
What's also interesting is that Zuckerberg highlights that American values are not shared by everybody, specifically mentioning that the values are not shared by every company we compete with or the countries they represent. This demonstrates not only that the values that are promoted by the tech CEOs might be opposed by others, but also that companies can be seen as representatives of countries. Considering the manner in which these CEOs engage with the United States and link their values to the United States global position, and the practice of the sharing of American values, it becomes evident that the CEOs propose that they themselves and their companies could be seen as representatives of the United States. What's also relevant is the notion that the American tech industry and the values of the United States might be under pressure or under threat. Like the personal struggles that are talked about, there's also a shared ideological struggle that has to be won. And the CEOs construct themselves and their companies as the ones that have the ability to lead this fight. In fact, listening to and looking at their discourse, they are apparently already doing this. They do need, however, the support of the country to continue to fight the good fight. In this sense, opposing big tech is, according to these CEOs, not just obstructing the tech industry's efforts to help the United States and its citizens, it's also undermining the United States and its values. So, which values are we talking about? Of course, grit and determination, interpreted in accordance with the American bootstrapping myth and American dream, is of key importance. Another value that's of great significance is techno-opportunity.
I share the committee's belief that competition promotes innovation, that it makes space for the next great idea, and that it gives consumers more choices. Since Apple was founded, these things have defined us. The first Mac brought opportunity and possibility into the home. The iPod helped musicians and artists to share their creations and be paid fairly for it.
As Apple CEO Tim Cook mentions, Apple's technology automatically created opportunities and tools for empowerment. In this sense, the mere presence of these tech companies and their technologies should allow people with grit and determination to take control over their lives. Other values that are of significance in the opening statements in relation to the organization of society are freedom, democracy, learning new things through technology, innovation, and open markets. Learning through technology can be linked to the concept of techno-opportunity, and the mentioning of open markets can be linked to notions of competition and antitrust. For the tech companies, open markets mean that markets are free from regulation and open for others to enter, preferably by using the techno-opportunity that was created by these tech companies. The latter is, for instance, also illustrated by Zuckerberg's notion that Facebook is enabling an open market, and Bezos' idea that Amazon provides the real estate that other companies use. The validity of the CEO's discourse and the values they describe are further emphasized by this helpfulness and the trust the companies, according to Bezos, evoke.
Making promises and keeping them, and making principled decisions, even when they are unpopular. And our approach is working. 80% of Americans have a favorable impression of Amazon overall. Who do Americans trust more than Amazon to do the right thing? Only their doctors and the military.
The idea that tech companies must sometimes do things that appear unpopular produces the notion that, like governments, tech companies sometimes do things from a caring perspective, which suppresses the notion that these companies are focused on making money and simultaneously explains why these companies sometimes get bad publicity while they're actually trying to do good. This argument, if accepted by the audience, can of course also be utilized in the future if these tech companies are under scrutiny again. So, what was foregrounded in these opening statements? In their spoken opening statements and other texts, the CEOs, their companies, and big tech are constructed as the true representatives of the United States on the global stage, on which they are struggling to retain ideological dominance. Instead of focusing on national opportunities for other companies to compete with their tech companies, the CEOs produce an image of society in which the United States and its citizens should support big tech to make sure that the United States emerges victorious from its ideological struggle. To do this, other companies must embrace the techno opportunity that was created by big tech and their American values, and subsequently decide to compete within the market that is enabled by big tech, thereby competing on the side of big tech instead of against big tech. Considering the proposed connection between the values of big tech and the values of the United States, being against big tech would be considered the same as being against the United States. In conclusion, this means that in their ideal imagined society, big tech is allowed to become the United States, incorporating everything as part of its global market under Silicon Valley-based government corporations, providing the country and rest of the world with techno opportunity instead of welfare, thereby both forcing and allowing people to make something of their lives through typically American grit and determination. So, as I promised at the beginning of my presentation, I would briefly return to the visual dimension of the hearing, which was also analyzed as part of this research. What stood out was not just the fact that the 4 CEOs dressed in similar manners, a way of dressing that fits the setting of the hearing and is therefore probably not very surprising, but for most, the results of the hybrid setting of the hearing. Because of COVID-19, the CEOs and some committee members joined the hearing through WebEx. Some media noted that this showed that the CEOs had already won, since it demonstrated the world can no longer function without the tech industry's technologies. What I also think is interesting is the probably unanticipated result that the hybrid setting of the hearing caused the CEOs to gaze directly at all of their audiences through their webcams, producing a more direct type of address than they would have been able to do if they had not performed their opening statements via their webcams. I believe the effect of this partially new way of addressing audiences through hybrid public hearings is an interesting topic for further exploration. Thank you for your attention.